Hello, this is Cameron, and welcome to another video by the Lab Maniacs. As always, we have all deck lists from this video listed in the description below, as well as our social media info. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another Laboratory Maniac deck tech. This time it's Dan and Sigi again, coming at you with a deck tech for Dan's Thrasios and Tymna Doomtide list. So,
Yeah, it's a pretty fun one. I've been really enjoying this deck so far on the games I've played on camera and off camera through the cEDH Discord. It's been really enjoyable.
yeah, and it's performing really well. I have lost to it way too much.
That's the goal.
But yeah, that's what we're gonna bring you today, and let's start off easy. So, Thrasios and Tymna, what exactly do they do?
So of the two, the more important one is Thrasios. He is the 2 mana, costs a blue and a green for a 1/3. He's the Merfolk Wizard, who for 4 generic mana has scry 1, then reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it on the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, draw a card. So what this means is we have a infinite mana sink that does not require any specific mana of any sort. So he's very easy to put, depending on how you build him, to put monolith combos like Grim Monolith and Power Artifact for infinite colorless mana. He's also very easy for things that are colored mana sources like a Dramatic Scepter build with Dramatic Reversal and Isochron Scepter, or with a Bomberman combo using Auriok Salvagers and Lion's Eye Diamond. No matter how you cut it, he's an extremely powerful card. And there's a reason that there's probably 3 or 4 different brews going around with these exact same 2 partners, because it's a great color combination and he is a powerful commander.
Yeah, I've noticed that people have been testing this color combination a lot. And there are a lot of different strategies, but as we said, we're gonna bring you one specific strategy with those 2 commanders today in a deck that was built by you. So let's talk about how exactly that deck works. How do you usually win?
So that's actually an interesting question. I don't usually win with any particular method. There's a few different options that I can go down. I can tutor up the Bomberman combo, which is the Auriok Salvagers and Lion's Eye Diamond combo I mentioned. So I can activate Lion's Eye Diamond's ability with Auriok Salvagers in play. It'll make me 3 white mana and discard my hand. I can activate Auriok Salvagers for 1 generic mana and 1 white mana to return the Lion's Eye Diamond in my hand, netting me 1 white mana. And I can repeat this. I can make a whole bunch of colored mana of any color by first making a whole bunch of white mana, and then filtering it back down as I repeat this loop, making mana of every color. So I can make a whole bunch of mana. I can play Thrasios. I can draw all of the non-land cards in my deck, put all the lands into play tapped, and then do something. I can cast an Aetherflux Reservoir and cast Lion's Eye Diamond 1 more time to gain, like 1,000 life because of how much I've looped it. I can play Laboratory Maniac and draw a card with one of the bunch of different draw spells in this deck. Or, those are really the 2 big ones after you've Thrasios. Other options I have are actually just going hard mode and manually storming off. So I have High Tide, I have a lot of rituals, and I have things like Time Spiral and a lot of different draw 7s to be able to go the way that Reverse Mermaid Still Have a Storm list goes off and just play a bunch of spells, draw a bunch of cards, make a bunch of mana, and eventually get an Aetherflux Reservoir out, cast a couple more spells, and then fishbowl everybody at the table to death.
Yeah. That
and then
has... Yeah? Oh, there's even more?
One of my... Yeah, oh, there's plenty more. One of my personal favorites is to cast an Ad Nauseam on like turn 3 or 4 and hold priority and cast Angel's Grace.
Yeah,
Go
that's a
to
good
some
one.
negative triple-digit life total and have my deck in my hand. And with this, you drop a couple of free artifacts like a Mana Crypt and a Mox Diamond, and then cast Labman and draw a card again. So it's got a lot of different methods by which it can win, and it's extremely easy to shift between them as the tone of the game progresses, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I love this deck so much, is that I can play to the table, but also play to the board of the table, not just what commanders I'm seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing I've also been noticing. Like, if somebody does something against one of your ways to win, you can just pull out another one within like a turn or two.
Yeah, and if
It's
things are really going poorly, I can just drop a Leovold into play and tank, which
Yep,
is a lot of fun.
that's a thing.
It is so easy to enable a turn 3 Leovold in this deck. I have had so many people get mad at me for that. I've played against a Leovold player multiple times and gotten my Leovold into play before he gets his. And that is just
Oh,
an
that's
amazing
nice.
feeling.
But yeah, so a couple of things regarding your ways to win. In case it's unclear how Etherflux Reservoir works precisely, since you said that you only need to cast an LED once after you've done all of that. Basically, even if Reservoir comes into play at some random point in your turn, it doesn't start counting at 1, but rather at the amount of spells cast before this turn. So if you've cast 1,000 spells, then it's gonna give you 1,001 life for that LED, and so on. And
Yeah,
another
it's pretty
thing,
awesome.
so on storm turns, a lot of people sometimes have trouble tracking all of their stuff, like mana, storm count, and so on and so forth. Do you have any tips for people on how to like do that properly and not get lost?
Yeah, so that's one of the fun things about this deck. You can use a set of basics that you happen to like to help track your mana. You can put the basics all nice and neat up at the top of your library, or at the top of your playmat, and put some dice on them to start tracking mana as you go. And Star City also has an excellent storm counter that you can use to
Oh yeah.
track storm. So having some sort of useful physical aid by which you can demarcate what these like random dice that you're putting on your playmat means is a really beneficial way for other people to see what's going on, for people on camera to see what's going on,
Oh
and
yeah.
for you to just be able to track all the myriad of things you're actually doing.
Definitely, and it takes a lot of mental stress off you on your combo turn.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked at length about all the different win conditions in your deck, how you get there, but how exactly do you like position yourself to win? How do you navigate there?
There's a lot of different methods. So there's a whole bunch of tutors in this deck that give me a lot of redundancy, but they don't all grab the same things. So in part, how I'm navigating to victory is often in context not only of what people at the table are doing, but of what my deck is kind of handing me on a platter. So if I get an opening hand that has a whole bunch of fast mana and like an Enlightened Tutor and an Eladamri's Call, I'm probably going to try and go for a Bomberman combo.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, being able to acknowledge when other people are more of a threat than you and try and slow the game down a little bit, play a bit of a control game is important. So there's a lot of counter spells in the deck that give me the ability to interact on the stack. There's a pretty solid amount of removal for a storm deck, or for a primarily storm deck, so that I can interact with decks like Isan or opposing laboratory maniac decks. So like Abrupt Decay is really good against those decks.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have the ability to disrupt, like I said before, a Leovold. So while like a single random hate bear looks pretty bizarre in an aggressive storm deck, it has done more work for me than most of the other cards in this deck, because it single-handedly can slow down a lot of storm decks for
Mm-hmm.
multiple turns. So if you get a hand that has a lot of ramp, not a ton of card draw, but you have a lot of interaction, you can play a slow game. It's not necessarily going to be as good as something like a Grand Arbiter deck or as Cameron's Tasigur Control, but you can play a pretty solid slow game with this deck, because Thrasios and Tima combine to grind you out value. You have some extra mana, dump it into Thrasios and draw a card. You have Tima in play, you can kind of poke people every now and then and draw some cards that way. So there's a lot more late game than you would expect from a fairly all-in combo deck.
Yeah, that is very reasonable. I think if Leovold somehow were able to stop ad nauseum, then he'd be like the single best hate bear in the entire game.
Honestly, I'd rather him be able to stop Teferi than Ad Nauseam. I can handle an Ad Nauseam, but Teferi is so much harder to deal with than a single Ad Nauseam.
Good. All right. Yeah, you've already alluded to the amount of interaction you have in your deck. Are there any other ways to protect yourself from other decks? And what do you do to interact with them outside of your removal pieces?
So some of the best ways we have to interact with other decks are just to kill them early. There is a game I played recently where a Yisan player was in a very strong position on like turn 2 or something, which was very obnoxious. Maybe it was turn 3. I don't remember entirely. But I kind of had to gamble on an all-in line and try and just get him.
Okay.
And while trying to combo off, there were so many obnoxious points that he just kept stymieing me. Like my candelabra got shuffled into my library as I was casting High Tide. Like there's just a whole mess of things going on. And I was able to barely cobble together enough spells to actually be able to get to 50 off of an Aetherflux Reservoir. So one of the more amusing ways we have of interacting with our opponents is not actually killing the table, but just killing the primary threat, which is one of the weirder ways of like interacting in EDH, but being able to not just win all at once, but get the guy that's actually a threat and then try and rebuild for the next guy, which is one of the things Aetherflux Reservoir does so much better than prior Storm cards, even though it's not a Storm card, but you know. So stack interaction obviously is important, but also being able to pick what you're interacting over is kind of hard, but that's kind of just a skill you pick up in normal Magic. I'm obviously no expert at this. I'm just, some guy at a keyboard playing some cards that are better than I am. But like knowing that you're probably not supposed to pick a fight over your opponent's Leovold 90% of the time is something that I've started realizing, which is kind of awkward, but like it is better in a lot of cases to just try and aggressively slow the game down in addition to the person trying to slow the game down than it is to try and deal with other people's threats and go off. So if people start stalling things, this deck almost wants to help them instead of try and end step, answer, and then combo, which is something that I've been noticing as I've played it more, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, that does seem really unusual. It's not something I've really heard anyone else say about any other deck.
Yeah, so in part, I think it's the addition of green to these Storm decks, like giving us Sylvan Library, giving us Thrasios to slowly draw cards off, giving us Tima to slowly draw cards off. There's a lot of ways to grind out value, as I indicated before. So while it is like 98 of the cards in this deck are, expected Storm cards, the like 2 cards that are different are actually really impactful for that kind of a game.
That kind of reminds me of the Corridor deck tech we did, in a way, where basically you said that you don't actually want to cast your commander, but if things get rough, then you can bring him out and he does some good work.
Yeah, I seem to really enjoy having, and in fact, a lot of competitive EDH decks seem to enjoy having commanders that are really good as backup plans. Zer's a pretty decent plan C. Tima's a pretty decent, I guess it's more like a plan D or F in this deck. Carador's a great plan C. Like, it's just kind of interesting how you can build a really strong deck, but to shore up its weaknesses, you kind of have to have a useful commander.
Definitely.
Some interesting philosophical thoughts.
So, one question that probably a lot of people are interested in, since those partner commanders are kind of new. What does your deck do better than other similar decks?
I think this deck is one of the most versatile combo decks I've played ever because of the multitude of different combo routes you can take. being able to High Tide Storm versus being able to combo off with Bomberman versus being able to Ad Nauseam Angel's Grace, all for different win cons, is important. And half of those different combos can result in different ways to end the game. So if I draw my deck with Thrasios, but I've had my Laboratory Maniac Praetor's Graft, I can just Aetherflux Reservoir. Like, almost all of my ways to end the game will give me an opportunity to either default to a Laboratory Maniac plan or to a Storm kill, which I think is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as I've mentioned multiple times, the bizarrely effective long game that this deck has for a Storm deck is very important. So I'd like to think it is pretty good at all different stages of the game, which isn't normally the case with a lot of decks.
That is definitely true. So, speaking of like strengths and weaknesses, what is your deck bad at? Which kind of weaknesses does it have?
In the very early game, if someone sticks a Thorn or a Sphere, this deck is crippled. So if you can get a really fast, like turn 1 or turn 2, Sphere of Resistance, Thorn of Amethyst, Trinisphere, any of those effects, this deck is going to have real problems. Because I rely heavily on building up, so sculpting my hand or building up early mana, more so than a lot of different decks. Obviously, a lot of different Storm decks like Zur and Jaleva will have even more artifact ramp than I will, but I don't have the inevitability that just a turn 4 Zur or a turn 5 Zur has. I have to like really get to that interaction. So while I can grind out value with Tima's not a attack, and I have a Necropotent, so you'd better watch out next turn, kind of thing. So if you slow me down hard in the early game, I'm going to have trouble coming back. If you're sticking those sphere effects on turn 3 or turn 4, then they're probably helping me as much as they're hurting me. But those really early taxing effects are killer for this deck.
Yeah, I think I've noticed that once in a past game we played, where I think I played a Winter Orb, and that basically helped you go off because you had Nature's Claim in your hand.
Yeah, Nature's Claim, Abrupt Decay, that stuff, I love that stuff. If it's sometime after I've managed to slightly build up some mana. Because you play Winter Orb, I'm just going to tutor up a Leovold, stick him, and sculpt my hand with Tima. And it's just great for me. Like, I don't want those cards in my deck, but I want you to play them on turn 3 or 4.
Yes. I think it's actually amazing how good this deck is at exploiting slower and more controlling decks. That is something that's, in my opinion at least, very unique to this list.
Yeah, and obviously no one's really played with this deck a whole lot. I've barely played with it compared to a lot of the more traditional and established lists. I'm still figuring out why a lot of these things are the case. I'm only just starting to get a feel for that they actually even are accurate. So obviously take a little bit of everything I've said with a grain of salt, because I'm figuring it out just as much as anybody else.
Yeah, it's magical. For the last segment, as usual, of our deck techs, please show us 3 different opening hands. 1 God hand, 1 definite mulligan, and 1 hand where you'd have to think about whether to keep it or not.
So something that I would consider a God hand would be an Arid Mesa, an Island, a Mana Crypt, a Mox Diamond, Auriok Salvagers, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Pact of Negation. So what this hand does is lets me cast Auriok Salvagers on turn 1 with Pact of Negation backup and combo out with Thrasios. I can play my Lion's Eye Diamond, activate it for 3 white, loop it with Auriok Salvagers, make unbounded mana of every color, draw my deck, do whatever. So this would be one of the more powerful openings that the deck is capable of. Winning on turn 1.
The thing that's a bit, let's say, extreme about this is that it doesn't even seem like that much of a stretch to just get that kind of hand.
Yeah, and it's really easy to make sure that that happens by turn 3, let's say. Turn 2 isn't even out of the question, but like turn 3 with so much redundancy, that's normal. But again, like that's just true of most of these decks.
Mm-hmm. So, what's the bad hand?
So for an absolutely unkeepable hand, we're looking at something like Doomsday, Leovold, Candelabra of Tawnos, Birds of Paradise, Eladamri's Call, Mind's Desire, and Tundra. So we've got one land. It is an island, but it's not the right island. It can't cast our Mana Dork. Candelabra of Tawnos is pretty terrible when we only have one land and, like, no High Tide and Acceleration. Doomsday and Leovold do not want to be in the same hand most of the time. And then we also have a 6-drop. It's a pretty garbage hand.
Yeah.
And I would not hesitate to immediately shuffle that back into my deck and redraw.
Yeah, that is just not good. Not good at all. Let's just keep moving.
So a hand that I would have to think about would be a Bayou, an Ad Nauseam, an Angel's Grace, Polluted Delta, Carpet of Flowers, Force of Will, and Lotus Petal. So this hand would be partially dependent on the table. If you're playing against a Yisan and a Selvala, unkeepable, because, Carpet of Flowers is beyond useless. If you're playing against a Teferi and a High Tide deck, a Zur or a Jaleva, this is starting to look more reasonable. So being able to play Carpet of Flowers on turn 1 is an incredible mana advantage. What this hand offers you is the potential for a turn 3, if your draws cooperate, Ad Nauseam with Angel's Grace backup, which is incredibly powerful because you draw your deck. And it also has the potential to enable you to do that with protection in Force of Will. So it's kind of a toss-up. If you don't get another blue card for Force of Will, you're kind of just going to cast the Ad Nauseam naked and hope it works. If you don't have your opponent's lands cooperate with you, like if they play a Mana Confluence or a Command Tower, then you're going to struggle to actually hit the Ad Nauseam and Angel's Grace quickly, which can make it weaker. And if anything disrupts it, you kind of don't really have much. So you're going to have to start grinding out value with Thrasios and Tima and just hope that someone else is playing stacks. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a toss-up. I like to play kind of risky, so I'd be inclined to keep it against, like blue decks, but that's just me.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm also usually a bit more on the no fear side of things, so I probably would have kept that hand, but it might have come back to bite us.
Yeah, I've had several hands do that to me recently. It's been unfortunate.
Happens. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all for the Doomtide, Thrasios, and Tymna deck tech. And it was a pleasure having you once again. I'm looking forward to even more fun deck techs. And we'll be seeing you guys next time.
See ya!